Good afternoon and good morning. Welcome everyone to the online Geneva Trade and Development Workshop, which is a seminar series jointly organized by the CEPR, the Geneva School of Economics and Management, the Graduate Institute in Geneva, UNCTAD and the WTO. For today's seminar, I'm delighted to introduce Steve Redding from Princeton University, who will present International Friends and Enemies. As we are in the second term of the series, many of you are already familiar with the format, but let me briefly summarize the main features for any newcomers. The presentation will last 1 hour and will be followed by 15 minutes of questions and answers. During the presentation, please feel free to ask clarifying questions in the Q&A window. With the help of my co-hosting colleagues, I will try to relay them to Steve. We are also very lucky to have some co-authors on the paper with us today, and they will also help us with answering questions. So without further ado, Steve, the floor is yours for an hour.
Thank you very much, Frederick. Thank you very much for the invitation today. Hopefully you can all see my screen. Can everyone see it okay? Wonderful. So thanks a lot for the invitation to present today. We're really excited about it. I'm going to present a new paper called International Friends and Enemies. Ernest sends his apologies. He's teaching at the same time as the seminar, but Benny has also joined today and will be monitoring the chat and can answer questions. So what's the motivation for this paper? Well, as you all know, rapid economic growth in China and emerging countries has seen a dramatic change in the relative economic size of nations in recent decades. And of course, a classic question in the international trade literature is what is the effect of such economic growth on the income and welfare of trade partners? And a related question in the political science and international relations literature is how does such a change in the relative economic size of nations influence political tension between countries? The so-called Thucydides trap, where growth in Athens created fear in Sparta that made conflict between the two more likely. And so what we're going to do in this paper is provide new theory and evidence on both of these questions. In particular, we're going to develop new bilateral friends and enemies measures of countries' income and welfare exposure to foreign productivity shocks. So these measures can be computed just using observed trade data of the kind that's readily available. We show that they're exact for small shocks in the class of international trade models characterized by a constant trade elasticity. And then for large shocks, we provide an analytical characterization of the quality of the approximation in terms of the observed trade data. And I'll show you some evidence later that in practice, for the magnitude of the productivity shocks implied by the observed trade data, the approximation is almost exact. Method's computationally fast. We compute over 1 million comparative statics in a matter of seconds on a contemporary laptop. And crucially, one of the sort of key challenges of using existing quantitative trade models to think about these kind of questions is that when one solves the nonlinear model for the counterfactual effect of productivity growth, then the model is extremely nonlinear and it's very hard to get a kind of economic intuition for the role of different economic mechanisms in deriving precise numerical numbers. In contrast, our measures are going to be sort of extremely transparent. They yield an exact decomposition in terms of different underlying economic mechanisms in the model, which is going to allow us to quantitatively interpret numerical results directly in terms of the underlying economics. Furthermore, because these sort of methods are very easy to implement, we actually show how to compute them across a wide range of different trade models in the paper, including single sector, multiple sector, input-output linkages, a wide range of different frameworks. And so it becomes very easy for a researcher to assess how robust a result is across quantitative models. You know, right now, it's sometimes very hard to get a sense of how sensitive a numerical result is to the precise details of the model. In contrast, it's going to become very, very easy to assess that with these methods. So in particular, what we'll show is that the first order general equilibrium effect of a productivity shock in a given country on income and welfare in all countries around the globe is going to depend upon just 3 observed matrices of trade data. The first of those matrices is very familiar. It's the matrix of expenditure shares. What is the share of expenditure that an importer devotes to each exporter? Second of those matrices is just going to be the mirror image of that. It's going to be the share of an exporter's value added that is derived from each importing market. So looking at things from the exporter side instead of the importer side. And then the third matrix is actually going to depend on the product of the first two. And we're going to refer to it as a cross-substitution matrix. And it's going to control how, when a country experiences an increase in its productivity and an improvement in its competitiveness in all markets around the globe, to what extent does that lead consumers in those markets to substitute towards the country with higher productivity and away from other countries, hence the term cross-substitution. And so we'll show that this matrix representation yields a kind of clear decomposition into different underlying economic mechanisms in the model. We'll show that the income effects of productivity shocks depend upon what we term market size and cross-substitution effects. The welfare effects of these productivity shocks depend obviously on their income effects, and then also on mechanisms through the change in the cost of living. We'll show, because of the linearity of these methods, it's very easy to decompose overall effects into the contribution of individual sectors. And we can see whether more rapid productivity growth, for example, in China, affects US income and welfare through the US market, the importers market, through the Chinese market, and then also importantly, through third markets. So we can look at sort of indirect general equilibrium effects through third markets in a very transparent way. And then in the time available, we'll briefly sort of implement that methodology using the NBR World Trade Database on over 140 countries over a period of more than 40 years. We'll compute the effect of a productivity shock in any country on income and welfare around the globe. We'll show that our analytical results, which are exact for small shocks, are in practice close to exact even for large shocks of the magnitude you see in the data. For example, we find R-squareds between our linearization and the full nonlinear model solution of above 0.999. And I'll show you just how good that approximation is. And then towards the end of the paper, we'll turn to this sort of classic political economy question, and we'll see whether our new bilateral measures of economic friendship between countries, how friendly growth in one country is to welfare in another, we'll see whether they can predict changes in political realignment as suggested in the political science literature. And we'll find indeed, as suggested by political scientists, as countries become greater economic friends, they also become greater political friends. And obviously what we're doing here today builds on a sort of vast literature in trade on the effect of productivity growth on income and welfare, both conceptually in the traditional literature, quantitatively more recently in quantitative trade models, and then it also connects with work on sufficient statistics. More recently using sort of data on trade shares to compute changes in welfare, such as, for example, the famous ACR formula for the welfare gains from trade. What's sort of really key about what we're doing today is this sort of new matrix representation that we introduce. And we'll show you how we can use that new representation to derive a whole bilateral matrix of elasticities, of the elasticity of income and welfare in each country with respect to a productivity shock in any other country. And we can actually compute those matrices in closed form just using the international trade data. And it's really the sort of matrix representation and the associated matrix inversion that allows us to do this. But perhaps I should sort of pause briefly there just to see if there are any clarifying questions before going further into the details.
I don't see any question in the chat, so you can go on. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Frederick. So in terms of the rest of the presentation, I'll start just by looking in kind of very general terms, in a very general trade model. How should we think about the income and welfare effects of productivity growth? Then we'll specialize to the class of trade models with a constant trade elasticity. And so that's going to be the class for which we can derive our matrix representation with these sharp bilateral predictions. I'll then briefly flag how these techniques can be easily extended into a wide range of different settings. And then we'll move into the empirical implementation with the data. So here's the sort of very general framework for thinking about the effect of productivity growth on income and welfare. We're going to consider an Armington model of trade, but it's going to be a general Armington model in the sense that we're going to allow for any homothetic unit expenditure function. And so what's the country's welfare or indirect utility? That'll just depend upon its income. We've got a single composite factor of production here. Think of it as labor, which receives a wage of W. And then we've got a general homothetic unit expenditure function, script P, which depends upon the entire vector of the prices of every country's good in import market N. And so goods here are differentiated by where they're produced, by their origin. So what is the price of a good produced in I and consumed in N? And so notice here we're using the notation that the first subscript is the country of consumption, the second subscript is the country of production. Well, that's just going to depend upon the wage in the country where the good is produced, productivity in that country, denoted by Z, I here, and then, of course, bilateral iceberg variable trade costs of shipping the good from where it's produced in I to where it's consumed in N. So how should we think about the effects of productivity growth in this model? Well, we're just going to work with the market clearing condition, that income in each country I has to equal expenditure on the goods produced by that country. What's expenditure on country I's goods? Well, we're going to add up across all markets N, income in each of those markets, multiplied by the share that that market spends on country I. Okay, and you can see here, for the moment, we've assumed trade balance, but we'll relax that assumption later. And what are these expenditure shares? Well, they just take the normal form. They're determined by Roy's identity from the indirect utility function. So how do we find the effect of a small change in productivity? Well, we're just going to totally differentiate this market clearing condition because we're interested in productivity shocks. Initially, we're going to hold trade costs and endowments constant. But again, we have extensions later where we show, for example, how to use the same methods to look at trade cost shocks. So what do we get when we totally differentiate this market clearing condition? Well, we get a system of equations for the N countries in terms of their N log changes in wages. And what do those N log changes in wages depend on? Well, they depend upon the exogenous vector of productivity shocks, the D log Z's that we're feeding into the market clearing system. And then you see they depend upon two key expenditure shares that I mentioned earlier. The share that each market N spends on each country K, that's the little S's. And then they also depend upon the share of income that each country I gets from each market N, the little T's. And then what's the final term in here? Well, the final term here is this theta NIH. What is theta NIH? It's the elasticity of expenditure in market N on exporter I with respect to a change in the price of country H. So it's a cross-partial elasticity. When country H's price changes, how do consumers in all market N change their expenditure on other countries I? And that's going to be crucial to thinking through the general equilibrium effects of productivity growth. And then, of course, for the welfare effect of productivity growth, that's just going to depend on the change in income and the change in the cost of living. And that change in the cost of living just depends again on our expenditure shares, little s, the changes in wages, and the changes in productivity. Now, in this general model, these cross-partial elasticities are potentially very rich. They're actually functions. They depend upon the entire vector of productivities, the entire vector of endogenous variables in each economy around the globe. But there's going to be one special case of this framework where we're going to be able to get very, very sharp predictions for the income and welfare effects of productivity shocks. What is that case? Well, it's going to be the ACR class of trade models with a constant trade elasticity. Because in that class of models, if we could return to our market clearing condition, it dramatically simplifies. All of those complicated endogenous cross-partial elasticities, they just reduce to a single constant trade elasticity, theta. Okay, and then we have all of the remaining terms. And then the welfare equation stays exactly the same. Welfare just depends on the change in income and the change in the cost of living. Now, what's the sort of key insight of our methodology? Well, the key insight of our methodology is that this market clearing condition actually has a matrix representation. Okay, so I can stack these market clearing conditions for each exporting country I. I can stack them, and I'm going to have a vector of changes in wages in each of the countries around the globe. And then what am I going to have on the right-hand side of this equation? Well, I can rewrite this nasty summation up here in matrix form. What have I got? Well, I've got several matrices. I've got our matrix of income shares, capital T. And then I've got another matrix M, which I'll describe in more detail. That's going to be called the cross-substitution matrix. And it's going to depend upon the product of the income shares T and the expenditure shares S. And then again, we've got a matrix representation of the welfare effect in every country, just stacking the change in welfare for every country around the globe. Again, it has a matrix form where the only matrix that matters for welfare is going to be the expenditure share matrix, capital S. So let's briefly think through the economics underlying these matrix representations and how we're able to implement this in practice. We're allowing productivity in every country around the globe to change. So we've got a vector here of changes in productivity, d log z, in every country around the globe. How do those productivity changes affect income? Well, there are two kinds of effects that I hinted at earlier on. The first effect is going to be through substitution patterns. When, for example, China gets more productive in this market clearing condition, what does that do? It reduces the price of Chinese goods in every market around the globe. And so what are consumers in those markets going to do? Well, they're going to substitute towards Chinese goods, which got cheaper, and away from other countries' goods, say Mexican goods, whose prices at the initial equilibrium hadn't changed. And so those pattern of cross-substitution effects is going to be summarized by this matrix M. What does it depend on? Well, the beauty of the constant elasticity import-demand system is that this matrix only depends upon the product of the expenditure share, how much each market spends on China, whose productivity has gone up, and the income share, how much income every other country around the world, I, derives from this particular market. And then I just add up across all markets H, and that fully summarizes the change in cross-substitution patterns across all markets around the globe. And so that's the first effect of productivity growth in every country. It induces cross-substitution towards the country whose prices have gone down and away from every other country. And then, of course, in general equilibrium, those productivity shocks change wages. And those changes in wages also affect these cross-substitution patterns, as you can see here from the term in wages. And so this is our first key effect of productivity growth, this cross-substitution effects. However, of course, there's a second very natural effect in all of these models, which is that when a country gets more productive and wages change, that changes market size in every country around the globe. Because income is going up and that's increasing market size. And that expansion in market size is going to raise the demand for every country's goods. How much is each importer going to develop from that, going to benefit from that increase in market size? Well, it'll depend upon what share of its income it gets from each of the markets that have expanded. And so that's determined by our income share matrix T, the share of income that each exporter I derives from each market N. And that's our second key economic mechanism through which productivity growth affects income. What about the impact on welfare? Well, that's, as we mentioned earlier, it's just the impact on income, adjusted for the change in the cost of living. And that change in the cost of living just depends upon the share of expenditure every market spends on each of the exporters around the globe, and then the change in costs from those exporters. And because we're holding trade costs constant here, the change in exporters' costs is just the change in their wages and the changes in their productivity. And so now we've completely summarized these very complicated general equilibrium effects in terms of these three channels: cross-substitution, market size, and cost of living effects. And then the key insight of our method is now we've represented it in this matrix form, we can just rearrange that matrix representation, and we've got a very simple matrix inversion problem. Okay, obviously, we need to choose a numeraire in order to solve for nominal variables like wages. And so we pick world GDP as our numeraire, although you can pick any numeraire you want. It won't change the predictions for relative changes in income or changes in welfare. And so we just rearrange our market clearing condition, and then we've got this very clean matrix representation here. On the right-hand side, we've got the exogenous vector of changes in productivities, d log z. On the left-hand side, we're solving for the vector of changes in wages in every country. And what is this W matrix? Well, this W matrix is our matrix of friends and enemies. It's an n by n matrix. An individual element in row I, column n, is the elasticity of wages in a country I with respect to a productivity shock in any other country n. And even though this is in general a very complicated framework, very high dimensional, many countries, very complex general equilibrium effects, it turns out that we actually get this closed form solution for these elasticities of income in every country with respect to a productivity shock in any individual country. And as we saw earlier, those income effects just depend upon the income share matrix, and the expenditure share matrix. Those two together determine M, the cross-substitution matrix, and it just depends on the single constant trade elasticity theta. And then we get an analogous closed form solution for the elasticity of welfare in every country I with respect to a productivity shock in any other country N. And so you just give us the trade matrices, and we know the trade elasticity. Then in seconds, we've got this very simple matrix inversion, and we obtain these closed form elasticities for bilateral effects of productivity growth around the globe. And that's going to be a key input into our empirical analysis later. So one question you might have is, well, how does this linearization, which is derived obviously for small shocks, how does it compare to solving the full nonlinear model solution? For example, using the Decaled Quantum Exact-Hat Algebra. And so here on this slide here, we've compared our prediction in red here to the standard full nonlinear model solution in blue. And in this case, where we're just considering productivity shocks, we can rewrite that full nonlinear model solution in the form we've shown here at the top of the slide. And comparing these two representations, what do you notice? Well, you notice the first term is exactly the same. It's just the term in productivity growth. It's the same in the two expressions. So the only reason they differ is through the second term. How does the second term differ? Well, for the full nonlinear solution, it's the log of a weighted average across different countries around the globe, where the weights are income shares. For our linearization, it's the weighted average of a change in logs in every country around the globe. And so these two terms only differ because of this difference between the log of a weighted average and the weighted average of a log. Okay. And so when will those two expressions be the same as one another? Well, notice there are two limiting cases in which the two expressions are identical. As we converge towards autarky, so there's no trade, the two expressions become exactly the same because TNN and SNN go to 1. And the two expressions are also exactly the same under free trade, when income shares are the same across all countries around the globe. And so in those two limiting cases, we'll get exactly the same predictions as the full nonlinear model solution. More generally, in the paper, we derive analytical expressions for the magnitude of the second order and higher order terms in terms of the observed trade matrices. And so the key feature of this matrix representation is, for the first time, we can actually analytically characterize the magnitude of the second order and all higher order terms in terms of the trade elasticity and these three matrices that we've introduced. And in practice, we find our approximation is almost exact, even for large productivity shocks, given the observed trade matrices. Okay. And that's going to have a very simple intuition. Why? Because we know it's exact under autarky, under free trade. We also find it performs very well for random trade matrices. And it's going to turn out that the observed trade matrices are very, very well approximated by a linear combination of those three cases. And I'll show you exactly later just how well the approximation does in practice. But perhaps now would be another good time to pause, just in case there are any questions about the baseline methodology.
Yeah, there were two clarifying questions. One was by myself, and Benny Kleinman, your coder, answered it. And the other one was also answered by Benny, but I guess the person who asked the question could not see the answer. So Sean Ray is asking, does the share of the tradable vis-a-vis non-tradable sector of a country have any role?
It's a great question. So yeah, in developing these results to make it as simple as possible, we've considered the sort of standard ACR class of models where there's just a single sector. There's a single traded sector, and each country is consuming goods from all other countries. But as you pointed out, of course, in reality, some goods are non-traded. More generally, within the traded sector, we might have multiple industries with different characteristics. And so you're sort of anticipating the point I was going to make next, which is that it's very straightforward to extend this matrix representation to a much larger class of trade models. And in particular, we do exactly what you've asked, which is we extend the model to allow for a single traded and a single non-traded sector. That's one of the extensions we report. And we also report an extension where we allow for many sectors. So several non-traded sectors, and then several traded sectors where the traded sectors might differ in terms of productivity, in terms of trade costs, and so on. And it turns out that this matrix representation still goes through. And so maybe just to respond to the question, I'll briefly mention all those extensions. First extension we make is we relax some of the ACR assumptions. We allow for trade imbalance and show how everything generalizes. Next thing we do is we show our approach doesn't just work for productivity shocks. An exactly similar linearization and matrix representation can be derived for trade cost shocks, allowing both productivity and trade costs to change. Another thing we do is we derive our baseline results for a constant trade elasticity, but we show that this matrix representation actually lends itself to deriving bounds for what would happen if you departed from the assumption of a constant trade elasticity. So we use matrix results from matrix perturbation to place a bound on how far wrong we would go if the true trade elasticity is variable and we assume that it's constant. And then, as I just mentioned in reply to the questions, we introduce multiple industries, like in the Costanzo, Donaldson, Kamunja paper. And then we also introduce both multiple industries and input-output linkages, like in the Caliendo-Paro framework, where you've got a full input-output matrix that's disciplined by the observed inter-industry flows in the data. And again, we show exactly how to construct the T matrix, the S matrix, and the M matrix. And so the way those changes to the models matter is they change the elements in the M, S, and T matrices. You have to calculate them in different ways, but in every case, you just calculate them from the observed trade data. So if you know the trade data, you can compute those two matrices and implement our matrix inversion. So that answer the question. Does that cover those questions, Friedrich?
I guess so. I would say so.
Great, great. Okay, so why don't I continue, and in my remaining time, try to sort of showcase some of the things we can do with the framework. But maybe just finally briefly mention, we also show actually very similar results can be derived in economic geography models. So we look at the Helpman 1988 model, which has been very influential in the new economic geography literature, and derive the corresponding linearization in that setting. And so in that environment, you not only have trading goods, but you also have people being mobile between locations. Whereas, of course, in all of our trade applications and in everything I'm going to do for the remainder of the talk, we're going to assume populations immobile in line with sort of restrictions on population mobility between countries. So let's dive into the application. So we're going to implement that. What data are we going to use? We're going to use the NBR World Trade Database as compiled by Rob Feenstra. So we've got data on more than 140 countries for over 40 years, from 1970 to 2012. And that's going to be a period that includes some very large-scale trade shocks. So China's emergence into the global economy following its reforms in 1978. And then obviously also the fall of the Iron Curtain in 1988-89 in Eastern Europe is going to provide another large-scale trade shock within sample that we look at in the paper. And then we combine those trade data with some information on income, population, and distance from the CEPR gravity database. So let's walk through the empirical results. So first, I'll just show you how well does this approximation perform for large shocks. We know it's exact for small shocks. How good is it for large shocks? And then we'll look at what has been global patterns of productivity and shocks around the globe, and how have they affected income and welfare in every country. And then finally, we'll look at the political economy question. As countries become greater economic friends, do they indeed become greater political friends? So turning first to the quality of the approximation. So how are we going to answer this? Well, first thing we're going to do is we're going to take the full nonlinear model and the observed data on trade flows and income, and we're going to invert that nonlinear model, and we're going to recover the implied changes in productivity and trade costs that occur over our sample period. Okay, and so we're just going to use the standard Exact-Hat Algebra to invert the model. And so in this case, we're using something like a head-Rees index to recover changes in trade costs. And then once we've recovered those changes in trade costs, we recover changes in productivity implied by the observed data. And of course, changes in trade costs and productivity are only separately identified up to a normalization, because obviously an increase in productivity is the same as a reduction in your trade costs with all partners, including yourself. And so we use a normalization that your trade costs with yourself don't change, although nothing in particular is going to be sensitive to that normalization. So now we've got the changes in trade costs and the changes in productivity implied by the observed data, which you know are large in practice. And so we can now combine those with our approach and see how well does our approach do in approximating the empirical value of these productivity shocks. And so we're going to run a horse race. So the first horse in the race is we're going to take the productivity shocks we recovered from the data, and we're going to feed them into the full nonlinear model and do a counterfactual for how would income change if the only thing that changed during our sample were the productivity shocks. And so obviously that differs from the data because we're holding trade cost constant. Okay, so that's the first horse in the race. What's the second horse in the race? Well, that's what does our model, our linearization, imply is the impact of those changes in productivity. And that's very simple to compute. We've just got our friends and enemies matrix, W, that we recovered from our matrix inversion, and we just need to pre-multiply that with the productivity shocks. And so this is going to sort of illustrate a key advantage of this linearization. If we want to look at the effect of a productivity shock in any one country, we only need to do our matrix inversion once, and we've got this W matrix. Once we've got our W matrix, we can feed in any productivity shock we want in any of the N countries. In contrast, in the full nonlinear model solution, if I want to know what is the effect of a productivity shock in China alone, well, that's one counterfactual. And then if I want to know what is the effect of a shock in France, that's another counterfactual. And so if I shock each country one by one, I actually have to run N counterfactuals. Furthermore, if I want to know what is the effect of combinations of productivity changes, I actually have 2 to the power n possible counterfactuals I need to run. Whereas in contrast, we get the answer to all of those questions from a single matrix inversion in terms of our W. Okay, so very computationally powerful. How well does it perform for these large shocks? So on the horizontal axis, we've got the prediction of the full nonlinear model solution for these counterfactuals in which we only change productivity and hold trade cost constant. And then on the vertical axis, we've got the predictions of our linearization. And this is shown for a standard trade elasticity of 5. And so when we first created this figure, we thought we made a mistake. We thought we'd plotted the horizontal axis against itself. But we hadn't. Then we thought, oh, we must have made a coding error. There's some bug in the code. No, it's not. As you can see, these 2 sets of predictions are basically visually indistinguishable from one another, even though we've got some large productivity shocks here, productivity shocks of around 100%, 50% over this long sample period. So even for empirically reasonable productivity shocks, this approximation performs extremely well. So to try to probe that further, instead of taking the empirical distribution of productivity shocks, we run a Monte Carlo simulation. For every country, we draw a productivity shock from the empirical distribution with the replacement, and then we do that for every country around the globe. That's one simulation, and then we repeat that 1,000 times to simulate different productivity shocks from the empirical distribution, just to check if our results were sort of sensitive to the exact particular pattern of productivity shocks in the data. And so in the top panel here, we show you the regression coefficient from regressing the predictions of our linearization on the full nonlinear model solution. And as you can see, it ranges from 0.998 to 1.008. So our linearization doesn't appear to do too much violence to the data. And the R-squared in those regressions is all above 0.999. So extremely close approximation. So another question you might have is, well, how does that vary with the trade elasticity? You've assumed a standard value of 5, but what would happen if you change the trade elasticity? And so in the paper, we report results going from a trade elasticity of 2 to 20, which sort of spans the empirical range of elasticities people estimate. And across all of those trade elasticities, we still have R-squareds of above 0.99. Okay, so extremely strong approximation. Linearization performs better for productivity shocks than for trade cost shocks. And that has a kind of a natural explanation. Why? Because as we saw earlier, for productivity shocks, this first term is the same because we can take it outside the summation term here. Whereas for trade cost shocks, the direct effect of the changes in trade costs is still inside the summation. And so the 2 expressions differ for another reason. But nonetheless, we still find very high R-squareds and very large slope coefficients. And the linearization still does a pretty good job approximating the full nonlinear model solution. Okay, and so the approximation is not only exact for small shocks, but in practice, for empirically reasonable trade elasticities and empirically reasonable productivity shocks, it provides a very close approximation to the data. So now let's look in practice and see what we can do with this methodology. Because we only need to do this matrix inversion once, it becomes very easy to do very large numbers of counterfactuals. So in the paper, we compute more than 1 million comparative statics in which we shock productivity in every country around the globe in every year of our sample. Literally, because we're doing that matrix inversion once, it's like a couple of seconds on a laptop. So it really lends itself to applications where the application itself requires a counterfactual as a key input. And so this shows mean global welfare exposure for each of the years in our sample, the black line, and then the 95% confidence interval in gray. And so as you can see here, average welfare exposure is positive. The absolute numbers here are very small, and that's just because we're considering infinitesimally small changes in productivity here. If we were to kind of multiply this by the empirical magnitude of productivity shocks, we get numbers exactly the same as in the Exact-Hat Algebra, as we saw earlier. So the key insight is not the level of the scale, but the trend over time. And what we find is that on average, over our sample period, countries have become much more exposed to foreign productivity shocks. Okay, and so these are mean exposure across all of your trade partners, excluding yourself. And so this is consistent with the view that over the sample period, it's a period of hyperglobalization, as many people have emphasized, as recently Paul Ernest has discussed in a recent paper. And consistent with that hyperglobalization, we see countries become increasingly interdependent on one another over time. The other thing you see from this graph is there's a fair bit of dispersion in these welfare effects of productivity growth. And we provide more evidence on that in the paper. So even though on average, the effect of one country's productivity growth on a trade partner is positive, that average hides a lot of variation, and it also includes some negative effects. When productivity in a country goes up, some trade partners can be harmed. How? Well, that's very intuitive. It comes from the standard neoclassical theory, terms of trade effects. And the way to think about it in our framework here is suppose China gets really productive and it starts supplying a lot to the European market. And suppose there's another country, Mexico, that previously used to sell a lot in the European market, but now China's got much more competitive. Mexico is selling much less than it did before in the European market. What's that going to do to Mexico's income? It's going to reduce Mexico's income. And so it's because of this cross-substitution effect in the model, that's how you can get negative effects of foreign productivity growth on domestic countries' welfare, even in a single sector model. And then, of course, once you're in a multi-sector model, you have even richer terms of trade effects from standard theory. You know, why might there be these negative effects of productivity growth? Well, as we know from neoclassical theory, the effect of productivity growth on trade partners' welfare depends upon whether it's export or import biased. And so industry comparative advantage becomes another source for these potential negative effects of productivity growth. So one rich feature of the framework, as I mentioned, is we get this whole matrix of bilateral effects of productivity shocks from a single matrix inversion. And so that lets us look in detail how the whole network of welfare exposure has changed over time. And so we've illustrated that with a network graph here for 1970, the first year of our sample. And so we're showing here the 50 largest countries in 1970, and we've drawn the 200th strongest edges. So the edges here are the bilateral impact of a productivity shock in one country on welfare in another. And it's probably hard to see on the screen, but you can see it more clearly in the paper. There's an arrow on each of these edges showing the direction of the impact. So here, this is a productivity shock from France to Portugal. And the size of the symbols denoting each country is proportional to their size in terms of GDP. And we're focusing here on the 200th largest edges, which are actually all positive. And so we're here showing positive effects of welfare exposure. And so what do we see in 1970? Well, we see that the network of welfare exposure was dominated by large industrialized countries like Germany, the US and Great Britain. They had the productivity growth in those countries has the biggest effect on welfare in other countries. But as we roll forward throughout our sample period, we see quite dramatic changes in this network of interdependencies in global markets. So as we roll forward to 1985, we start to see the emergence of a cluster of newly industrialized countries, with Japan at its center here. And we also start to see Western Europe emerging as a separate cluster by the mid-1980s. As we roll further forward in time, we see those clusters of newly industrialized countries and Western Europe becoming even sharper, distinguished. We start to see North America emerging as a cluster with the US, Mexico, and Canada having these very strong linkages to one another. And also, if we start looking within the East Asian cluster of newly industrialized countries, we start to see China increasingly challenging Japan as being at the center of that network of economic interdependencies. And then as we roll forward to 2012, where our sample finishes, we see that China actually displaces the US at the center of the network of global interdependencies. The US is actually much closer to this East Asian network than it is to the network of Eastern and Western European countries that is increasingly forming as a separate network over time throughout our sample period. And so we find these very large changes in global patterns of welfare exposure consistent with changes in trade integration as countries like China have emerged into world markets. And in this European cluster here, you'll see Eastern European countries increasingly becoming integrated into it as other events such as the fall of the Iron Curtain change these patterns of global interdependencies. And we explore that in further detail in the paper. So what I want to sort of highlight now is a bunch of other things that you can do with this framework because it's sort of very rich. It enables us to decompose these overall welfare and income effects into different mechanisms. And so I'd just like to highlight some of the other things that we can do with it. So one of the things we do in the paper is we show that we can decompose the full first order general equilibrium effect of a productivity shock on income and welfare. We can decompose that into partial equilibrium and general equilibrium effects. And so we sort of illustrate that here. So here we've got the general equilibrium effect of a productivity shock in China on welfare in the US in every year of our sample. And as you can see here, we find US benefits from Chinese productivity growth, positive effect on US welfare, although as you'll see later, a negative effect on US relative income. So in blue here, we have the partial equilibrium effect, which is China gets more productive. The direct effect of that is to reduce the price of Chinese goods and raise welfare in the US. But of course, there are general equilibrium effects. As China gets more productive, its wages go up, and that reduces the competitiveness of Chinese goods and reduces welfare in the US. And so each of these different lines here shows additional rounds of general equilibrium effects. And we sort of show in the paper, because we recover our GE effects from a matrix inversion, and the spectral radius of that matrix is less than 1, it actually has a Neumann series representation in which we can separate out the partial equilibrium effect and each of the higher orders of general equilibrium adjustments as you kind of update general equilibrium wages and solve for the whole fixed point of the general equilibrium system. And then down here in yellow, we've got the full general equilibrium effect. And this sort of highlights just how important it is to incorporate these general equilibrium effects in these quantitative trade models. What else do we show? Well, we decompose our overall income effect into market size and cross-substitution effects. We find both of those are quantitatively important. And as I mentioned earlier, it's the cross-substitution effect that drives negative effects of productivity growth on welfare. So as China gets more productive, it can reduce income in some countries, such as Mexico, that it's competing with in global markets. We then also decompose the overall cost of living effect into the income effect, the overall welfare effect into the cost of living effect and the income effect. And we show that cost of living effect is actually very, very powerful. And so it can be very misleading thinking about welfare effects to just look at relative changes in incomes because of the magnitude of the cost of living effect in these quantitative trade models. And I'll show you an example of that in a second. Another thing we do is we use our model to highlight how when China becomes more productive, that not only affects the US in the US market, as emphasized in the kind of recent reduced form literature, looking at the impact of the China shock on the US, but it also has effects in the Chinese market, in the country experiencing the productivity growth. And as I've highlighted before, it also has third country effects. And so one thing we can do in the model is look at those third country effects. And so I've done that here. So this looks at the third market effects of China on the US. And as you see, we find sort of quantitatively relevant third country effects, and they display a very, very intuitive pattern here. So what are the top 3 markets where there are these third country effects? Well, Canada obviously makes a lot of sense because Canada is a big market for the US. And what does this cross-substitution effect depend on? Well, it depends upon the share of income the US gets from a market. So for Canada, that's a very big share of US income out of all of its foreign trade partners. And then the second thing these cross-substitution effects depend on is what share of the market's expenditure is devoted to China. And now, Canada doesn't spend a huge share of its expenditure on China, but nonetheless, China is an important trader for Canada. And so when I take the product of the US's income share from that market with the share the market spends on China, I find a very influential third market effect for Chinese competition in the Canadian market for the US. How about Singapore and Japan? Well, those are also very intuitive. Obviously, the US gets a lower share of its income from Singapore and Japan than it does from Canada, but nonetheless, they're both big countries in terms of GDP and their non-trivial sizes of US income shares abroad. Furthermore, Singapore and Japan are obviously very close to China, and they have very, very high expenditure shares on China. And it's so even though the US derives a lower share of its income T from each of those markets, both of those markets have very high expenditure shares S on China, and so that's what drives these third market effects. So quite intuitive pattern of third market effects. And again, we provide some more evidence on that in the paper. Another interesting thing that comes out of our analysis is, as I highlighted earlier, we can compute this matrix inversion not just for the ACR class of models, where we have a single sector, but we can also compute them for multi-sector models, where we have a very rich range of both traded and non-traded sectors. And then we can also compute them for models where we have an input-output matrix between industries. So we have upstream and downstream linkages between the industries. And so one very interesting result I'll just briefly highlight is we actually find a pretty strong correlation between the predictions of single sector, multi-sector, and input-output models for thinking about the welfare effects of productivity growth. And so I'll just sort of flag here to make that comparison a fair comparison to the single sector model. We actually consider an extension that someone mentioned earlier in a question, which is that when we look at the single sector model for this comparison, we allow it to have a single traded sector and a single non-traded sector, because obviously non-traded sectors are important in the data. And then we compare that model with a single traded and a single non-traded sector to a model with many sectors and a model incorporating many sectors and input-output linkages. Maybe surprisingly, we actually find the aggregate effects of productivity growth, an increase in the productivity in a country across all sectors. Those aggregate effects on different trade partners around the world are actually very, very strongly correlated in these three sets of quantitative trade models. Here's an example of that for the US. Again, looking at the impact of Chinese productivity growth on income and welfare in the US. So the left panel is the income effect, and the right panel is the welfare effect. Obviously, any effect on the level of US income is going to be sensitive to what you choose as your numeraire by construction. And so to ensure the results are invariant to whatever we choose as our numeraire, we show results in the left panel for US relative income. And we compare the US's income compared to the OECD average, a weighted average of OECD countries by their income shares. And here in dark green, we've got the input-output model. In the dashed orange line, we've got a model with multiple sectors. And then the dotted green line is our model with a single traded and a single non-traded sector to make the comparison a fair one here. As you'll see, across all three models, we find a very similar pattern of results. Higher Chinese productivity growth reduces US income relative to the weighted average of OECD countries. Strikingly high correlation between the three models. Notice that we find stronger negative effects of Chinese productivity growth on US income in the multi-sector model than we do in the single sector model over time. That's also very intuitive, because what's happening over time is Chinese comparative advantage across industries is getting closer and closer to US comparative advantage across industries as China develops and it goes through structural transformation across industries. And so in the multi-industry model, that tends to reduce US income more because of these terms of trade effects. That China is moving increasingly into industries where the US has a comparative advantage, and that drives bigger negative terms of trade effects than in the single sector model. For welfare, we find, as I mentioned earlier, Chinese productivity growth raises US welfare. The magnitude of that effect becomes bigger over time as China becomes a larger share of world GDP. And that's again consistent with the strength of these cost of living effects in the quantitative trade models. Again, fairly similar pattern across the three models. And that's a feature not just of this comparison, but more generally in the data. Striking feature of the welfare figure is we obviously find much bigger effects of foreign productivity growth in a model with input-output linkages than we do in either of the other models. That's also very intuitive, because in the input-output model, when China becomes more productive, it doesn't just reduce the price of Chinese final goods, which reduces the cost of living in countries that import those goods. It additionally reduces the cost of imported intermediate inputs, which then in turn reduces the price of other countries' goods sold in markets around the world. And so that's the standard multiplier effect with input-output linkages, that the effects of productivity growth are multiplied through the whole input-output structure, highlighting the importance of international production chains. Okay. And then one sort of final thing we can use our framework to look at is that although when we go from a single sector model to a multi-sector model, or a multi-sector model with IO linkages, we find very similar aggregate effects of productivity growth. Of course, the effects on individual industries could be quite different within countries. And so in particular, we show in the paper that using our matrix inversion, we can calculate the effect of productivity growth in each country on industry sales in every country around the globe, just using the matrix W that we inverted earlier, and then transforming it in the appropriate ways. And so now we can see how even a common productivity shock across all industries in China, so common productivity growth as China emerges into the global economy, that can have very different effects on industry sales, depending on input-output patterns, depending on patterns of linkages through global value chains. And so that's sort of one of the key other sets of results I'd like to highlight. We've shown that here for a few interesting cases. So again, we're looking at a Chinese productivity shock. The top two countries are other countries in Southeast Asia, and the bottom two countries are resource-rich developing countries, in particular Brazil and South Africa. And then each of these different lines show how, when we increase China's productivity across all industries, how does that affect the sales of different sectors? And so as you can see here, again, very intuitively, faster Chinese productivity growth has very negative effects on industry sales in the textile sector, both in East Asian countries and in resource-rich developing countries, consistent with, as China grows and initially has a comparative advantage in industries such as textiles. Then strikingly, we find a very different pattern of which industries have positive effects, or the most positive effects from Chinese productivity growth. For East Asian countries, those sectors are electrical, medical, to a lesser extent the office sector, again, electrical up here. And so what is that capturing? Well, that's capturing input-output linkages through factory Asia. That as China becomes more productive, although that increases competition in product markets, it also reduces the cost of inputs for countries in Southeast Asia, and that can benefit the sales of other industries in other countries in Southeast Asia. In contrast, in these resource-rich developing countries, such as Brazil and South Africa, we find a very different pattern of effects for the industries that benefit from productivity growth. In their cases, it's mining, basic metals, it's resource-intensive sectors. Again, that's very intuitive. It's driven by the global pattern of linkages through input-output linkages. As China expands, that increases the demand for mineral resources. And in countries which have a comparative advantage of mineral resources, that draws resources into those sectors and away from other sectors through a form of general equilibrium Dutch disease. Okay, so really quite rich and interesting set of predictions that comes out of the multi-industry model with input-output linkages at the more disaggregated sector level. And then in my last 5 minutes, I'll just sort of revisit this political economy question we started with, which is, as countries become greater economic rivals, do they become greater political rivals? Well, because we've got our matrix inversion, and we've got this matrix W of bilateral dependencies in welfare, we can see to what extent do those bilateral dependencies in welfare influence countries' political attitudes to one another. And so how do we do that? Well, we do that using two different measures of countries' bilateral political attitudes, taken from the political science literature. So we follow the literature which has used patterns of voting in the United Nations General Assembly to measure how countries' political attitudes are similar to one another. And so we consider three different measures of similarity of countries' voting patterns in the United Nations General Assembly. We then also use measures of strategic rivalry, which political scientists have put together. And these are based on contemporary perceptions of political decision makers about whether foreign countries are competitors to them, are latent or potential threats to them, or actual enemies in the form of armed conflict. And so we take those measures from the political science literature and we examine to what extent they're correlated with our measures of the extent to which countries are economic friends. And so the basic regression is we're going to have the political attitudes on the left-hand side. We've got them, they're bilateral between country N and country I in every year of our sample T. So it's a three-dimensional panel, importer, exporter, time. And then on the right-hand side, we're going to put our U matrix, our matrix of bilateral welfare exposure. Again, we've got exporter, importer, and time, and we recover it from the matrix inversion we saw earlier. We're going to allow for an exporter-importer fixed effect to capture some unobserved aspect of countries' attitudes towards one another. We're going to allow for time effects to allow for sort of secular trends over time. And then we'll estimate this relationship both with OLS and then also with an instrumental variable strategy in which we instrument trade flows using a strategy that builds on Frankel-Romer's work in the trade literature. So what do we find? Well, here we've got results using three measures of the similarity of countries' voting patterns in the United Nations General Assembly. And then a fourth measure, which looks at how similar countries are in terms of being close to the United States, or what is referred to as a sort of Western liberal order in this literature. Across all of these measures, the similarity measures, we find that as countries become more economically friendly, and so because we've got an exporter-importer fixed effect, this is all identified from time series changes. As countries become more economically friendly in terms of the welfare effects of their productivity growth, they start to vote in more similar ways in the United Nations. Okay, we find that across all three different models and across all three different measures of voting similarity. And this here is the instrumental variables results in which we instrument using the sort of Frankel-Romer strategy that we discuss in more details in the paper. When we use our strategic rivalry patterns, or how far countries are away from the US liberal order, we find that as countries become more economically friendly towards one another, they both become closer to the US Western liberal order, and that's hence the negative coefficient here. And they're also less likely to be strategic rivals as coded in the political science literature. And so whatever measure of political similarity we use, whichever of our three main models we consider to measure the welfare effects of productivity growth, we find this very sort of consistent pattern. As countries become more economically friendly, they also appear to become more politically friendly towards one another. And this sort of illustrates the richness of the matrix inversion. It's because we've got all these bilateral welfare effects that we can kind of compute this in a very easy way, and we recover them from a single matrix inversion. And then just to stay on time, I should try to wrap up what we do in the paper. We examine a classic question in the trade literature, which is how does foreign growth affect income and welfare? And then we turn to apply that question to a second issue in the political science literature, which is as countries become greater economic rivals, do they become greater political rivals? What's the main contribution? Well, we developed this new bilateral matrix representation of the first order general equilibrium effects of productivity growth on income and welfare in all countries. We recover this bilateral matrix from a single matrix inversion instead of having to do a whole sequence of different counterfactuals for different productivity shocks around the world. It's very easy to implement, just using observed trade data. It's exact for small productivity shocks, for the class of trade models with a constant trade elasticity. And for large shocks, we develop analytical results where we characterize the quality of the approximation in terms of the observed data. It's computationally fast, implements in seconds, and it reveals an intuitive decomposition of overall welfare effects into market size, cross-substitution, and cost of living effects. Along the way, we sort of highlight the importance of these general equilibrium effects in quantitative trade models, and we show how it's very easy to use this method to see how sensitive your results are across alternative quantitative trade models. And so, typically researchers do counterfactuals in a single quantitative trade model because depending upon the counterfactual, it can be computationally intensive. Here, it's very, very easy to see how sensitive your results are across a whole suite of different quantitative trade models. We then implement the method using NBR World Trade data to highlight the global impact of productivity growth on income and welfare. And we show for the empirical shocks of the magnitude implied by the observed data, the approximation to the full nonlinear model solution is also close to exact. So it's not only exact for small shocks, but also close to exact for empirically reasonable shocks. And then finally, as I concluded, we find some evidence that as countries become greater economic friends using our new welfare exposure measures, they also become greater political friends, as measured using UN voting patterns and measures of strategic rivalries. But I should stop there and apologize. I think I've run about a minute over on time, but thank you very much. It'd be great if there are more questions.
We started 1 minute late, so you're perfectly on time. So yeah, we have a bunch of questions. So let me mention the people in the chronological order of the questions. So we have Marcelo, Richard, Stella, and Dizem Ertag. Good news also, Ernest, the third quarter of the paper has just joined us. So welcome, Ernest. So maybe Marcelo, you start asking your question, and then we turn to Richard, and we move down the list.
Thank you very much, Fred, and thank you very much, Steve, for a great presentation. My question is related to the fact that you focus a lot on productivity shocks. And as a guy who has been interested in trade policy all my life, I was wondering whether you could use this methodology with trade policy shocks, and in particular, bilateral trade policy shocks, because here the productivity shocks are MFN, and whether we can answer a question about whether it would be possible to think of answering a question about which are the optimal regional partners or preferential partners that you can have.
Yep, great question. So yes, it's actually very possible using this framework to look at, so we've looked here at trade cost shocks, which are obviously slightly different from tariffs, because here for a trade cost shock, there's no revenue raised. But I'll show you the results here for changes in transport costs. And then we've also worked out the tariff case. You just have to kind of take account of the changes in tariff revenue as well. So it turns out that it's very possible to use exactly the same methods. When you look at the market clearing condition, you totally differentiate. You've now, as you pointed out, got an extra term for changes in trade costs. And furthermore, it's bilateral because you want to allow for the fact you might have a bilateral relationship with a country. But you can stack things in exactly the same matrix representation. In order to use the matrix inversion results, you have to collapse the changes in trade costs, the bilateral changes in trade costs. Essentially, what you do is you define a measure of your weighted average inward trade costs. And that's a change in your trade costs with every partner weighted by its share of your expenditure. And then you define a measure of outward trade costs, which is the change in trade costs in the markets you're selling in, weighted by their shares of your income. And you know that we can compute those directly on the data. So if you have any assumed pattern of bilateral changes in trade costs, we know those shares in the data, so we can just very easily compute them. And then you just plug them into the matrix system and exactly the same inversion goes through. And you've just got these extra terms for the changes in bilateral trade costs to take account of. So absolutely, you can use the method to look at bilateral trading relationships. And then in tariff revenue, there are some extra terms for welfare because you're taking it, and for income because you're taking account of the effects of the revenue raised there. But yeah, you can totally use these methods to look at bilateral patterns. One thing we haven't done is try to work on the sort of optimal trade policy question, which you sort of hinted at, which would then be sort of choosing these bilateral trade policies optimally. But you know, there would be very standard optimal tariff type arguments that would be at work there, and you'd need to sort of make assumptions about retaliation and so on. It would be a classic sort of prisoner's dilemma situation, as we're kind of familiar with from the neoclassical trade theory. But absolutely, it's very doable to use these methods to look at bilateral changes.
Thank you very much.
Richard?
Thank you. So great presentation, Steve. Clearly going to be an important paper. I found your presentation incredibly clear, but that's probably because the paper is also very, very clear. And I think what it will do is help clear out a lot of misstatements and misunderstandings about what causes what and what's not important. So I do think it's a very important paper. But while you were talking, I was trying to figure out why it fits so well. And while you were talking, my brain was thinking, and I came up with a couple of hypotheses that I'd like you to react to. And I'm going to do it in two ways. First of all, I'm going to do it by suggesting a nonsensical counterfactual.
Mm-hmm.
What would happen if we took wages exogenous, and then we used your model to predict the productivity changes, and we would find, in fact, that we very closely fit the productivity changes as measured by using a model like yours to see what the productivity changes were. So that's the nonsensical thing. The second one is, what could possibly go wrong in your model? So if you have, what you essentially have is an expenditure system where expenditure patterns depend upon relative prices and income. That's pretty. It's not a lot's going to go wrong there, but you make some very bold. Let's focus on the simplest model. Make some very bold simplifications, which could go disastrously wrong, but don't. So the first one is Armington. You know, that would upset a lot of people in the heterolean world. The second is that the other factors don't matter. So this kind of one good is a good assumption. And three, that the IO linkages aren't really, really important. And so even in that simplest model, you do very well. So when I got all the way through that, what I kind of thought is that you maybe have come to a Solow-like result, where Solow said, if you can get your technological productivity growth right, we know what's going to happen. But then the next turn of growth theory was, well, what led to the productivity changes? Mm-hmm. Or another way to say that is, in your model, if both the wages and the technology were endogenous, then, and especially if technology in one country was affecting technology in another country, things would get a lot more complicated. So let me just end with what I think. I mean, I think this is incredibly clarifying and very good. And for theory's sake, it's really clarifying a lot. And so I want to see how you feel of why it fits so well.
Great questions, Richard. Thank you very much. Those are fantastic questions. I think there's sort of 4 or 5 questions there as well, which is really impressive. That's really useful. I'll do my best to try to respond. So it's actually pretty interesting. Actually, we were very surprised by how good the approximation was. So just sort of starting with one of your questions, which is sort of what could go wrong. And so what we thought would go wrong is we had this intuition initially, and I think many people have this intuition, that the CS model is actually highly nonlinear. And so, you know, for example, if you asked anybody, or before we started working on this, if you'd asked me what would the effect of a productivity shock in China be on income and welfare in any one country, my answer to you would have been, I can't tell you that. You're going to have to solve the nonlinear model because it's very nonlinear. There are all these complex general equilibrium interactions. And so what surprised us is that actually it turns out that the model's general equilibrium is pretty close to being log linear. And you know, what could go wrong could be that there are very strong nonlinearities that distort the general equilibrium and would make our linearization perform very badly. And so if we play with the trade elasticity, so if we take the trade elasticity down to 2, for example, we can make the model perform a bit worse. We can make the nonlinearities more important. But as you know, the slope coefficient goes away from 1. That's partly captured in the constant there. But the R squared still stays very, very high. Like the R squared is still 0.992 here across all 1,000 simulations for a trade elasticity of 2. So, you know, the thing that could really go wrong here is that the model could be very nonlinear, and that could lead the nonlinearization to perform very badly in practice. And what our results say is that actually, no, at least given the observed trade shares, given the observed trade matrices, the model turns out to be very close to being log linear, and this approximation performs very well. Interestingly, again, just to sort of illustrate what can go wrong, if you do the approximation for trade costs, it doesn't look nearly as good. And so this is the, you know, that correlation between them is extremely high. Again, the R squared, I think, is above 0.8, but the fit here is much less good for bilateral changes in trade costs. And so it's, you know, definitely, you know, we hadn't kind of loaded the dice in such a way that it had to be true. And the key thing really why the approximation works so well, one key element is that for productivity shocks, because they're common across trade partners, this first term here is exactly the same in the 2 expressions. And that's a key part of why the linearization performs so well. Formally, in the paper, we show just how well the linearization performs depends critically on the trade matrices. and in particular on how big the diagonal is relative to the off-diagonal terms. And formally, we kind of proved that you can bound that approximation using the eigenvalues of those matrices. And it turns out, in part because the diagonals are quite big, that most countries have very high trade shares with themselves. That's one of the things why this linearization is so good. And so even the largest eigenvalue of those matrices is quite small, and hence the approximation performs well. But I mean, there are lots of really great questions there. Let me try to just answer a couple of others, and I'm sorry if I don't remember everything. The other point you made, which I think was super interesting, was what would happen if wages and technology were endogenous through other mechanisms? That's something we haven't thought about a lot in this paper, but we have started to think about a bit in a follow-up paper we have, which is where we have agglomeration economies. So we do it in space. We actually do it in a dynamic model in space where we have an agglomeration effect. So as people move between regions, productivity changes through agglomeration forces. Actually, as long as those agglomeration forces are constant elasticity forces, so productivity is population density to some power or population to some power, the linearization still works pretty well because of the constant elasticity structure. And so I think that's, you know, the log linearization is approximating CES models quite well. And so if you keep that constant elasticity structure, it turns out that you can allow for some endogenous productivity effects, such as going beyond solo. Also, lots of other good questions. We haven't done the exercise you suggested, which is back out productivity using the nonlinear model and compare it to backing it out using our linearization. We haven't tried that exercise. My guess would be we would get slightly different productivities through the linearization because, as we just saw earlier, the linearization doesn't work as well for trade cost changes. And so because when we invert the model, we need to back out both productivity and trade cost changes, my guess would be that there'll be a strong correlation between the productivities in the two exercises, but because of the trade cost terms being slightly different in the linearization and the nonlinear model, we will get slightly different productivities. We haven't looked at all possible model extensions, and it's a great suggestion to explore other models and see if we can make the gap from our linearization be bigger. The ones we've covered so far have been the ACR class, so Eaton-Kortum, Armington, Krugman, Mellitz with an untruncated Pareto. We've covered those, and we've covered single sector models, multi-sector models like Costner, Donaldson, Kamunja, and multi-sector models with a Cobb-Douglas input-output structure like Caliendo-Paro. But we haven't gone beyond that class. And so I think related to your question, if we were to go to models with, say, translog utility functions or translog production functions, so which are kind of outside the CES class, or linear demand systems like Mellitz or Taviano, I think there the linearization might work less well because the nonlinearities might become more important. But that's a little bit speculation because we haven't tried really going beyond the sort of CES class of models. But they were all really great questions. I'm sorry if I didn't respond to everything. Great suggestions, and we'll look into all of them more.
Thanks.
Thank you. Then we had another two questions. The first one is from Stella Rubinova. So Stella, can you join us? Is it possible to get Stella as a question?
Hi, first disclaimer, this is actually under Stella's account, but it's Maria Sokolova. And I have a question. Yes, the technology, sorry. So I saw your I saw your graph on the third market effect and the network diagram, and they're like really visible clusters of regional trade agreement partners. So my question rather relates to what also Marcelo was saying, and also to the research I did on how signing regional trade agreements actually synchronizes voting in the United Nations. So have you looked into the regional trade agreements? Yes. So regional trade agreements and how they have affected, how they produced similar effect as what you're looking at.
So it's a great question. So far, we've mainly focused on productivity shocks in the paper, but as you pointed out, I still think that changes in regional integration are very, very important in understanding the changing incidence of productivity shocks. And so here we've illustrated that in Asia in comparing the trade network in 1970 and in 2012. And you sort of see a couple of things which I think are very closely related to regional trade agreements. And so here, what we emphasize is that regional trade agreements matter for the welfare effects of productivity growth because they change trade shares and they change bilateral patterns of trade shares. And so they will matter for countries' economic exposure to other nations. And you see that in a couple of ways here. You see in 1970, Japan really dominated the network of welfare exposure. Vietnam was tiny. Its productivity shocks had a little effect on other countries. Whereas when you go through to 2012, China becomes huge. Its productivity shocks have very large effects on other countries in Asia. Vietnam now has much more of an impact on Asian countries because it's liberalized in general and it's also signed regional agreements. And so in what we do so far, regional trade integration is important because it changes the incidence of productivity shocks. And I think that's very, very important. You see something similar in Eastern Europe as well, the fall of the Iron Curtain. I think one way your question is super interesting is you're now pushing us to go even further, which is to say, well, now look directly at the effect of those trade agreements. Look at the change in regional trade costs themselves. And that's something we are interested in. We have talked about it. There, the important element will be to use the bilateral results I was sort of flagging earlier in response to one of the other questions, but also take account of the changes in tariff revenue. And I think it would be very easy to kind of use a kind of framework like this to do an assessment of regional trade agreements. Looking at optimal policy is a little bit harder because you have an optimization loop over the optimal policy, but I think actually even in principle, you could do optimal policy as well. So it's a great idea. We haven't looked at it so far, but regional agreements still matter for our productivity effects because they change trade shares. But I agree with you, it would also be interesting to look directly at the welfare effects of regional trade agreements. It's a great suggestion.
Thank you very much. So I'm really sorry we are running out of time. So I kindly suggest DSM AirTag to contact the others directly with a question. And I apologize for not being able to take the question and share it with the rest of the audience. So let me thank again Steve wholeheartedly for this great talk, and Steve, Benny, and Ernest for this great paper. In 2 weeks from now, we will have Kalina Manova with us. And I hope to see many of you in 2 weeks. So many thanks again for joining us, and many thanks again to Steve.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Great paper.